Gia. So, today we're going to go through the study guide. Now, you might notice right off the bat, it is not in order. Because I want you to listen to this video several times, trying to find the answers, if you didn't already know them. Since I'm not in class with you, and I didn't take notes, and I don't have your notes, nor do I have access to any of the other tests or the study guides, I don't actually know what he taught you. But I do know the topics, and some of them seem a little subjective, meaning it's kind of open to interpretation, like, what did people think about somebody? How the fuck does he know? Anyway, we shall do this, and I don't know when you want to have this powwow. But, I'm available. I don't know your schedule, and I know you have other finals and shit to worry about. So let me know, because I had fun last time. So it all starts in Europe and about going to the New World. So back then they had these boats called the galleons. That was the Spanish things, but they were kind of obsolete because the Portuguese, they invented something called the caravel. Now the caravel, unlike the galleon, had a little rudder in the back to help make it steer it easier. So they could since they could steer it better, they could get to places like the New World. When Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, he came on the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. The Nina and the Pinta were actually caravels. It was lighter and smaller and thus faster. Now, the rudder helped it be fast. So why did Europe want to go to these new lands? Hell, they have land in Europe, so, why go? Obviously, you want more resources, and the bigger your country, the more secure you are. So there's economic, political, and religious interests. Because, in England, the Puritans, they were persecuted against. They didn't like them. They thought they were too religious. They kicked them out, and they're like, where are we going to go? We'll just go west. They also needed a shorter route to Asia. Now, they also wanted to avoid the Middle East. This part they don't normally tell you in school, but they did. Because it was dangerous. There were a lot of pirates over there, especially the Barbary pirates, and they wanted to avoid that. They didn't like having all their shit stolen when they were trying to get to India and try to exchange spices and stuff. So they needed to find more gold, more silver, more spices. They didn't have things to trade. So they all went, Europe, all they do is fight with each other. So they wanted to just get away with all these people that are fighting all over each other and just start all over again. Okay, so they get to New England, and they're like, all right, so what are we going to do here? Well, we're surrounded by a big fucking ocean, so we'll make the economy based on that. So the New England economy was based on the ocean. So, and now when you come over, you have to have some sort of governing document. Like, I was taught it was a Magna Carta of 1215. That was the basis of the Laws of Confederation and the Constitution, which we'll get into. Now, your teacher seems to think it was the Doctrine of Discovery, where you settle native lands. Now, the government, according to the Doctrine of Discovery, the government policy would encourage violence and forcing the people there to assimilate. This isn't exactly true. However, the teacher said this, so just tell him what he wants to hear. Bottom line is, we got to America, all these Native American tribes all fighting with each other. There was not one war in which we did not have an Indian tribe fighting on our side. Okay, they weren't united, they fell. Not our fault. Plus, most of them died from European diseases, which we didn't know they would do. That was an accident. Oops. So anyway, it destroyed the sovereignty and broke treaties and court decisions in order to try to settle in the new land without them trying to kill us with bow and arrows and shit. So it was kind of something that we needed to do, but that's what the Doctrine of Discovery was. Discover new land. We set up shop. It's changed hands several times between different tribes. So who exactly owns it, no one knows. So it just comes to by force. But we were very nice to the Native Americans. We even made it an official language for them, and wrote down court cases, and people were actually tried for stealing their land. So we were trying to be fair, but we didn't want them to kill us. So then we're a British colony. We like being a British colony. We all consider ourselves Englishmen. We're all good. Then, like we said, we're trying to get to America to avoid all these fights in Europe. And England and France are always fighting each other. So now France comes over, and they have this war with the Native Americans, the Indians. So it's called the French-Indian War, and the British were involved in that too. And then, so now, very costly war, it's over, fine. And Britain's like, shit, we have a big debt, we have all this money to pay back from this war, we're just going to tax the colonists, in America. Well, why the fuck are you going to tax us? We didn't fight this, we didn't pay for this war, we didn't decide to go to this war, we have no representation in the government. That's where the term no taxation without representation comes from. Because you cannot tax us and have us pay for something when we had nothing to do with the decision. We should be in Parliament and have a voice and say, hey, maybe we shouldn't go to war. But we weren't even allowed to say that. So it's not fair that you're going to charge us for something that we had nothing to do with and had no say in. It's bullshit. We didn't like it. So there was a writer in England, Englishman, named Thomas Paine. And he listened to us bitching about this and goes, actually, that makes a lot of sense. So then he decided to write a book, and a pamphlet, actually. It wasn't actually a book. And the pamphlet, he called it Common Sense. So, basically, listen, you're on the other side of the ocean. You're a lot bigger than England. Why is this tiny country on the other side of the ocean going to govern all you people? I mean, you're trying to get away from England because they were persecuting you. So why would you still be a part of them? That doesn't make any sense. And then the colonists were like, you know what? This Englishman, Thomas Paine, is actually kind of right. It doesn't make any sense for us to be part of England. We should stop doing that. So that's where it first happened. And then when England started taxing us more and had duties, and Britain started telling us what to do and how to legislate ourselves and infringing on us, we're like, you know what? Now it's making common sense is making a lot more sense now. It was common sense. Now, there are two types of forced labor in America. There's indentured servitude, and then there's slavery. Unfortunately, this was the times, and everyone had slaves. There's not one country that did not have slaves. We were not unique in this matter. The difference between them is indentured servants were sometimes paid, and it wasn't for life. You're like, hey, you don't have any money, you don't have a place to live, so why don't you live here, work off, and you work off your debt to us for feeding you and everything, and then eventually you can go off on your own. So there was an end date. Slavery, however, you were there for life, and they can send off your family and all these other things, and they kidnap you from Africa. So that's the difference between indentured servitude and slavery. Now, why did we go to Africa to get these slaves? Why not we just use the Native Americans? I mean, they're closer, and we seem to be good at fighting them. But so we needed them because there were big fields in the South, and someone has to pick the cotton and tend to them, and it's expensive to pay indentured servants all the time, so we kind of need slaves to do it. And also, indentured servants were kind of unreliable because they tended to leave and they started their own farms, so can't rely on them because they stayed with us. They're not very loyal. Well, yeah, but the one thing that set the Africans apart from other places is, unlike the Native Americans, they seem to be immune from the European diseases. We wiped out the Native Americans and the Indians with diseases that we didn't even know we had. But the Africans, they were fine. So how do the people don't like being slaves? I mean, They say that people yearn to be free. So, how do they resist? Well, they can rebel. That didn't work out too well. And actually, a lot of them did not rebel because when you're oppressed, you don't know you're oppressed, and you're uneducated. What are you gonna do? You have no education, no skills, and it's kind of scared to have to pay for your own house and everything and all your food. I mean, when you're a slave, at least you get food and shelter and water and shit. So they didn't really rebel as much as you would think they would. The other thing you can do is run away. Same problem as before, but this is less violent because not exactly like they were all like UFC fighters or anything. So running away was a better option. This is where the Underground Railroad comes in with Harriet Tubman and that stuff. Now, the other one you might be familiar with, it's being a little passive-aggressive. You just don't work as hard. You kind of walk slower. You take longer to do things. So, you just kind of drag it out a little bit because that was the other way that they kind of rebelled. Then some woman actually, her name is Harriet Beecher Stowe. She wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, here's the funny thing about Uncle Tom's Cabin that I'm sure they didn't teach you in school. Harriet Beecher Stowe had never been to the South, never been on a plantation, had no idea what it's really like down there. Yet, she wrote a book about it and talked about slavery. And Uncle Tom is actually the hero in the book. Not like now where they say conservative black people are Uncle Toms. That's actually false. Because Uncle Tom wanted to abolish slavery. He was not pro-slavery. But apparently they haven't read the book. So the North is like, yeah, slavery sucks. This Harriet Beecher Stowe is correct. The South is like, what the fuck are you talking about? What the fuck does she know? She never even came down here. She's never even been to the South. This is bullshit. Because they were complaining about that, the British started thinking, hey, you know what? We used to think the South had a point. Now, not so much. So they stopped sympathizing with the South. Now, I don't know why I wrote that here, because it's supposed to be in chronological order. And a lot happened before, Uncle Tom's Cabin. But anyway, so then back to the Revolution. So then Thomas Jefferson decides he's had enough. We're going to be independent from England. We're done. So on July 4th, 1776, which is why we celebrate that day, contrary to what was told a couple of years ago at your house, and why I wrote 1776 and Damon had no idea what the fuck I was talking about because he thought Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, which he did. Actually, Damon is 1792, but that's not the point. 1776, July 4th, that's what we celebrate. So, the document's probably pretty important if we have a fucking holiday named after it. So remember, Thomas Jefferson wrote it. And he was so proud that he wrote it that on his tombstone, he had 3 things that he was proud of. Jefferson was the 3rd president of the United States. Yet being president did not make the list. However, writing the Declaration of Independence was on that list. So your study guide will ask you, what was some of the things that Jefferson, did he call out George III, who was the king of England at the time? Was anything in this document attacking him? Which is a weird fucking question because the entire fucking document is attacking King George. He lists a bunch of things about why we hate this tyrant. He hated King George and why he's an asshole. And I try to write this on your driveway, but it is actually pretty long. And I went a lot of chalk, and I was dripping sweat, and then people started showing up, and so I couldn't actually get through the whole thing. So I'm just going to summarize some of the shit he talked about, because maybe it'll show up on the test. So, a long train of abuses. The king refused to assent the laws. The governors, we couldn't govern ourselves and we couldn't pass our own laws. And then there was a big group of people, but he wouldn't let us govern them with laws. So basically, we couldn't make our own laws. We had to listen to Britain and have them make the laws for us. The king threatened people to lose the representation in legislature if they passed a law he didn't like. So I was like, hey, if you do this, then you no longer have any representation. He didn't like that. The British legislature would meet in hard to reach places. So you're too tired, and then you get there and you're like, oh, fine, we'll just do that. Because you're not in the mood to fight, and they use that as an example. So they didn't meet in good places. You had to cross the Atlantic Ocean. So the king influenced other people to invade on other people's rights. We had no way to get rid of the Englishmen that were governing us and who were mean to us and annihilated us and killed us. We couldn't really grow in population, the laws of naturalization, so we couldn't be a nation that goes on. We had no trials and judiciary power to enforce the law. So it's like when we had a problem with someone, we couldn't just take them to court. Judges would get threatened for that they wouldn't be paid if they didn't rule the way the king wanted. You have all these new offices by Englishmen that doesn't make any sense. It's just basically to harass the colonists and take away their freedom. We had military in the streets during peacetime. It doesn't make any sense, but let's walk around. And then they infringe on our civil rights. So rules are made against our Constitution. Now, the British had an oral Constitution. They didn't write it down. And that's why we really wanted to write it down, because we didn't like that the British just kind of made up whatever their Constitution is. Well, Jefferson was upset because, the king's soldiers would kill us for no reason and there would be no repercussions. We weren't allowed to trade with the rest of the world. We were taxed without consent. So we have a big thing in America we call tax of the governed, and that came from this document. There's no jury in our trial. England just makes shit up, and we have to travel all the way to England just to go to court. We can't have a court case here. There's an arbitrary government enlarging our boundaries. The charters were removed from our government. We can't legislate ourselves. And King George wasn't protecting us and practically declared war on us. He plundered our seas, he ravaged our coast, he burnt our towns, and he destroyed our lives. He ordered us to kill our brethren, and he made us fight with each other. We don't want to fight with each other. We like each other. He actually got Indians to fight against us too. We didn't like that either. And when we try to complain, he doesn't really listen. He just ignores us. So he's a tyrant, and he's unfit to rule. So we're going to be independent, and that's what the Declaration of Independence said. So after the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War, now there was nothing mentioned in the Revolutionary War on the study guide, so we'll just go through it quickly, just in case you did. Started in Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill. A huge turning point was on Christmas Day. The Continental Congress elected George Washington to lead the Continental Army. So George Washington went across the Delaware River on Christmas Day, surprised the British, and kicked their ass. So now in the beginning, we didn't do so well in this war. Because the English were the best and most powerful army in the world, and we were just a couple of people, hunters and farmers and militia. So we couldn't really match up. And then we won the Battle of Saratoga. That was a turning point of the war. And after that, the French are like, hey, maybe the Americans actually have a chance to win this war. So they came to help. And then at the Battle of Yorktown, the English finally surrendered and we got our independence. Okay, so that's a big overview of the Revolutionary War. So the first shot at making our own Constitution, because remember, that's one of the things that we complained about in the Declaration of Independence. We wanted to make our own rules, our own laws and everything. So we decided to try it out. We call it the Articles of Confederation. And there were two plans. They had the New Jersey plan that said, small states should get rights too. And Delaware and Maryland were part of it. So if it's a smaller state, they probably agreed with New Jersey. So they wanted all the states to have the same number of representatives. So that way, large states couldn't just outvote the smaller states. And they call this a unicameral commission. This is as opposed to the Virginia plan. The Virginia plan, they wanted you represented based on your population. And it's called a bicameral commission. Uni means one, like a unicycle. Bi means two, like a bicycle. So if it's one, it's New Jersey, and if it's two, it's Virginia. So New Jersey thought this was kind of mean because the small states would be swallowed up by them. The Virginia plan won, and it was authored by James Madison, and he wanted a strong national government. New Jersey wanted state authority. So this led to the current day Senate and House of Representatives. The Senate, every state gets 2 senators. So that's based on the New Jersey plan. And the House of Representatives is based on the state's population, and that's the Virginia plan. So when we actually did put this into, we actually incorporated both of them. So when they say that Virginia won, I don't really understand that because there was a compromise. So set up the 3 branches of government, with the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. The legislative branch makes the laws. The executive branch enforces the laws and listens to them. And the judicial branch interprets them. So this is what they actually mean. So the president is in the executive branch. And the executive branch will, he elects his own cabinet, but there's one head of the executive branch, and that's the President of the United States. The head of the judicial branch is the Supreme Court. The legislative branch is the Speaker of the House. So that's what Congress is. Congress is in the legislative branch. And they all check each other because the legislative branch can make a law. The president says no. Executive branch, I don't like it. They veto it. And then if the president says, yes, I like it, the judicial branch goes, no, that's actually against our Constitution. That's not going to be a law. So they can all check each other, and that way nobody is too powerful, because we're trying to avoid tyranny, because that's why we left England in the first place. So this all went well and good. And then in Massachusetts, there was a slave named Daniel Shea. So him and other farmers complaining that they weren't paid enough. I'm sorry, Daniel Shea was not a slave. That was Nat Turner. So we had all these farmers in Massachusetts, so they were complaining they weren't paid enough. And so in 1780, which is only 4 years after we were a country, boss was like, hey, you have to pay us, okay? We gave you a loan, you gave us something to trade with, but we want our money that we gave you. Now, there's a debt crisis that happened. No one really had any money. And now with the high property taxes, it was getting kind of hard to pay back Boston. Now, Shea fought in the Revolutionary War. He was a Continental Army captain. So he and a bunch of other farmers decided that he was going to attack Springfield, Massachusetts. And the governor used his private army and quashed the rebellion. But, so, in the end, we did win. But after this, we thought, hey, the Articles of Confederation didn't really stop this from happening, so maybe we need like a stronger document to govern people. And that's when we had that's where we started talking about the Constitution. But we call the Constitutional Convention. Now, originally it was to amend the Articles of Confederation. Like, we'll just make some little tweaks here and there. But as they kept meeting, they're like, you know what, we just need a whole new document and call it the Constitution. But the Shays Rebellion proved that the Articles of Confederation didn't do very well, so we just need a new one. But originally it was to amend it. So then, what did we do? So then you had the Federalist versus the Anti-Federalist. Now, no one talks about the Anti-Federalist. So the Federalist Papers were written mostly by Alexander Hamilton, which you should know from the play Hamilton. And so he argued to ratify the Constitution. He wanted one. And James Madison and John Jay helped out. Now, they all used pseudonyms under the name publicists. Now, this is contrasting with the Anti-Federalist, which I think Thomas Jefferson was one, but they don't, the people don't confirm that. And they call themselves Brutus. So you have Brutus, Cato, and the Federal Farmer. They were on the Anti-Federalist, and no one really knows who their real names were. And the Federalists were Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. The fight between them is why we have the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is known as the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So basically, like, hey, we need this document to say what the government can't do. So we need to have a basic things of inalienable rights, because that's what Jefferson talked about in the Declaration of Independence. So then you had the First Amendment, the most important one of all. There's 5 freedoms that are unalienable, that cannot be taken from us. The freedom of speech. You can say whatever the fuck you want. You have the freedom of expression. Okay? And then you have the freedom of religion. And you can freedom to peacefully protest. Now, when all the Antifa and BLM were blowing shit up and saying, hey, we have the First Amendment, no, it's supposed to be peacefully protesting. And then, fake news start talking about how, where does it say that you have to peacefully protest? The First Amendment is where it says you have to peacefully protest. And the 5th one was a freedom of press. You have the journalists can write whatever they want, and unfortunately they like to lie and write things that are not true, but the First Amendment does protect them. So those are the 5 things: freedom of speech, expression, religion, protest, and press. Speech, yeah. So now we have all these 5 very important freedoms, but how are we going to protect them? And that's where the Second Amendment comes in: the right to bear arms. You get guns. Okay? You can't take it from me because I have a gun. Because basically, when you don't have a gun and the other people do, they can oppress you. And that's how we fought the British off, because we all had guns on our plantation. We walked through the wood and just picked them off one by one, because we weren't going to meet them in a traditional battle. If they try to tell you that it was for the militia, well, they did establish a militia, but nowhere else in the Constitution do they use the term people to mean a group of people. When they talk about people, they talk about individuals in every other part of the Constitution. So when it says for the people to bear arms, they meant individual people like you and me. So then you have the Third Amendment. Now remember what Jefferson complained about. You had all these people, all the military people being stationed in our homes without our permission. And we didn't like that. So we made a Third Amendment saying, hey, no soldier in peacetime or in war can go into someone's house without their permission. It's called the Quartering Act. Because the Quartering Act was what Jefferson was complaining about in the Declaration of Independence, where they could just put a military person in your house and you had to house them because it was the law. And that's not nice. So then you had the Fourth Amendment. Fourth Amendment is no illegal searches and seizures. You can't just come into my house and look for shit, okay? You need a warrant. You need to tell me specifically what you're looking at. You need probable cause. You need a reason to come into my house and search it, okay? So that's the Fourth Amendment that protects against that. So then you have the Fifth Amendment. You don't have to incriminate yourself. It's like, hey, if I answer this question, I'm going to go to jail. So I'm just going to plead the Fifth and say, I'm not going to answer this. And you have to be indicted by a grand jury. This is pointless because a grand jury always says yes. 99% of the time, a prosecutor goes to the grand jury and says, hey, can I sue this person? They go, yeah, absolutely. Because nobody is there to argue the other side. So now, the Fourth Amendment says the Fifth Amendment says a lot of things. It also says you can't take my property and use it for public good without compensating me. If you want my property to do something for the public, you have to give me money for it. Also, there's no double jeopardy. You can't sue me, I win, and then sue me again for the exact same thing. Okay, I won, you lost, that's done. So you always get a due process. If you want something from me, we go to court, and a jury of our peers will decide if you get it. Okay, so you can't just take it. Okay, we actually have to go through the process, due process, and get a decision. So then you have the Sixth Amendment, speedy and public trials. And remember when Jefferson was complaining of the Declaration of Independence, how we had to go all the way to England for something that happened in America? Well, that's not going to happen. These public trials are going to happen in the state in which they were committed. And you get a lawyer. You have the right to attorney, or else one will be provided for you in the Miranda rights. That comes from the Sixth Amendment. Then you have the Seventh Amendment. If we're in civil court and it's more than a $20 case that you want from me, you need to take me to court. You can't just take it or look for it. Like even in civil courts, we want a jury. So then you have the Eighth Amendment, no cruel and unusual punishment. So you can't, like, torture me. That's not nice. So, but, and also this set up the bail system. Like, you can get out of jail by paying a fee, and that fee cannot be too high that you can't pay it. So those are the 8 amendments of the, but remember, the Bill of Rights is 10 amendments, but your study guide said they only should know 8. I think I know why, but I'm going to get to that later. So the first electoral college chose George Washington as a president. Now back then, they said that when you have an election, the winner is a president and the second place is the vice president. So that was John Adams. This was so if you change anything, everyone agrees. Because obviously, well, not obviously, but usually the top 2 people were voted by the people, and they had different views. So basically, they didn't want presidents to be able to change things too much. So that's why they did it this way. Could you imagine if Trump was Biden's vice president or Obama was Trump's vice president? It would have been entertaining. Nothing would get done. And that might, I mean, if we had this for all of history, it might have actually been good for our country, but that's a different story. All right, so then during the Revolutionary War, Hamilton said, you know what, we have all these like small states, they don't have a lot of money, so we're just not going to make them pay their fair share of for the Revolutionary War we just fought. And this author's like, hey, that's not fair. We paid. Why won't they? Why shouldn't everyone else pay? So Hamilton's like, yeah, listen, they can't afford it, and there was a big fight back and forth. So Hamilton basically said, we'll put the capital in the South, and that way, and then the South like, oh, good. So we paid for it, now we get the capital. Now, Washington, D.C. is in the border of Maryland and Northern Virginia. It's not too south, but hey, South was okay with it. So, George Washington nominated Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of Treasury. If it has to do with money, and hopefully you know that if the Treasury has to do with money, it's Alexander Hamilton. That's all he cared about. He was very big on money. That's why he wanted a central bank. And Thomas Jefferson, who couldn't disagree with Hamilton more. They actually became really good friends later in life, but when they were both working in Washington's cabinet, they fought like cats and dogs. So the first thing they talk about was tariffs. Now, what is a tariff? A tariff is that if you get something from another country, you have to pay more. So it's like, okay, if it costs $20, but you get it from England, there's $5 because you didn't buy it from America. So you have a $5 fee because you bought it from England. This is against free trade. Jefferson was like, no, I like free trade. If England makes it cheaper, you should be able to buy it from England for the same price, for the cheaper price, and you'll be fine. Hamilton's like, no, we need tariffs. So lower tariffs was more of a Jefferson point than a Hamilton point. Hamilton also didn't want an agriculture economy. He wanted an industrial economy. He thought that was a future with textiles and mills and everything. And Jefferson's like, no, I'm a farmer, and 90% of the people living here are farmers, so we want an agricultural economy. The biggest difference between them is Hamilton wanted a strong federal government and central power. He was like basically like the Virginia Plan people. And Jefferson wanted everything to be left up to the states. So Jefferson wanted a small, limited government, and Hamilton wanted the federal government. The biggest fight was over the existence of the central bank. So Hamilton's big federal government wasn't even that big, when the biggest issue is whether or not there should be an American bank for all of America, not just separate ones for each state. So, it's been 8 years. President Washington gives his farewell address. So he had 3 points, and it was actually written by Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton wrote most of Washington's speeches. The first one is you can't be president for life, okay? So I'm going to resign before I die, so we know that this isn't meant to be a lifetime position. It's not supposed to be fun. So you only got 2 terms. And, the second point was we're all Americans, okay? So don't talk about how you're a Virginian, how you're from New Yorker, just Let's just all agree that we're all Americans. We're all in this together. We have to unite so that way other outside people can't take us over. So this regionalism and partisanship will destroy us. He also said we should be neutral in foreign wars. So we can't get involved just because people, our allies, are fighting other people. So we need to just stay out of it. You let Europe fight amongst each other, because picking sides is going to be dangerous, because then they're going to invade you and they're not going to like it. And so just don't piss anybody off, which probably pissed off the French, because the French were like, hey, we helped you get your independence, and now you're not going to help us fight a war with England. And we're like, yeah, no, we're not going to help you. We're on our own. We're staying out of this. So the first, shot at slavery was a man named William Penn. Hopefully, if there's a question about which state William Penn founded, you can figure out it's Pennsylvania. William Penn, Pennsylvania. It was named after him. So hopefully we can figure this out. So where the first capital of America was, where all the Continental Congress met and everything. And they passed the Gradual Abolition Act of 1780. This was the first abolitionist legislation in the Western Hemisphere. Abolitionist means anti-slavery. So this is the first time where people are like, hey, maybe slavery is a bad idea. So it was passed on March 1st, 1780. But to appease the slave owners, like, hey, we're not going to do this right now. It's like, we're going to gradually emancipate, which means freedom. Emancipate means freedom of slaves. Enslave people without making slavery immediately illegal. So we're just going to do it over time. Apparently it's going to take 80 years. So then 10 years after that, this man named Eli Whitney, some of you don't watch radar movies, but if you were allowed to, there's a book called The Book of Eli. Denzel Washington's a badass, just killing people. So I would think the Book of Eli, maybe remember Eli, friend of the black people. Eli Whitney was white. That's not the point. Point is that black people probably should like Eli Whitney because he invented something called the cotton gin. Cotton gin picked cotton. So now you didn't really need slaves to do it because we had this machine to do it for you. But that was going to take some convincing, as you know, because the Civil War is not happening for a very long time. So then Jefferson became president, and we all know Jefferson was not a spendthrift. He's like, I don't like spending money, I don't want a central bank, blah, blah, blah. And then Napoleon, the French dictator, all this land in America. And he's like, hey, I'll sell it to you for like really cheap. And Jefferson's like, well, that's a really good deal. Yes. And tripled the size of the United States. But, so he ended up spending a lot of money because Napoleon gave him a good deal. So when people talk about Napoleon wanted to conquer the world, I don't actually believe that, because he wouldn't have sold us a Louisiana Purchase and tripled our size for a very good price. So now that we have all this new land, and our country has tripled in size, we have to figure out what are we going to do with these new territories. And that's where the Missouri Compromise comes in. So now Missouri gets brought in as a free state, and Maine, which you want to go to college to, is a free state. And they established the Mason-Dixie line right under Missouri, and everything below, if a territory is below that line, it's slave, and if it's above that line, it's free. Despite this being a random line drawn on a map, this actually worked for 30 years until the Kansas-Nebraska Act fucked it up. More on that later. Now we have to talk about the rematch, the War of 1812. England's like, you know what? Fuck it. We think it's a fluke that you beat us the first time. We're going to invade and make you a colony again, because that was BS. And now that you have this neutrality thing, I don't think France is going to help you. So I think we can win this time. And this was the birth of American ingenuity, because the British cut them off from the supply chain. So now we couldn't import goods anymore. And maybe if Jefferson got his way, and we had Hamilton got his way, and we got tariffs, then we wouldn't have been importing so much. But it doesn't matter. We pivoted. We're like, we'll just make it ourselves. And this is good, because now we can feel independent. We don't depend on other people. We can be more sovereign, or we can govern ourselves. and be independent of everybody else. But it does come at a cost, because now that we're making our own stuff, we're manufacturing, and we're going to an industrial economy, we create labor struggles, and there are a lot of strikes by the workers who don't want to work because they were used to being in the farms and working outside with nature is better than working in the factory, and it weakened the material base of the institutional family community. But so we started being an industrial nation. Now, American patriotism actually increased after this war because we beat the British, the best army in the world, again. And the British, at this time, they did a lot of damage, because before we didn't have anything, but now we did. So they came in, they sacked our capital, they burned it down, they took down all the government buildings, they even burned down the president's mansion. They just fucked shit up. And we probably would have lost if it wasn't for this huge, storm, the hurricane winds that just destroyed their navy at one point. So if those people actually made it to shore, we might not be a free country. So some people say God was involved. I'm not going to go that far, but hey, nature helped us with this. First time the French did, this time nature did. And when we were rebuilding all these things, you know what? This place is pretty important, because, we wouldn't be rebuilding if it wasn't. And then Dolly Madison actually saved a picture of George Washington. So, you know what? We like George Washington. He's our hero. And so then people started, remembering what it was like in 1776, with all this independent fervor and revolutionary talk. And we're like, yeah, that's really cool that we're all Americans. And now we talk about Washington, these great generals, but the War of 1812, there are no big name people. It's just because they were fought by common soldiers and volunteers and sailors who just decided to defend their land. So it just kind of gave us we're all in it together, because only 12% of the people wanted to go to the Revolutionary War. Now everyone was like, you know what, they invaded, they attacked us, and we've stood our ground. We like it. And that's why the national anthem was written about the War of 1812. The bombs bursting in air, the rockets' red glare, that was all the War of 1812. And our flag was still there. And that's where the patriotic fervor comes in. So then let's go into court cases. So on March 6, 1819, in McCulloch versus Maryland, the Supreme Court says, yes, Congress can establish a federal bank and the states aren't allowed to tax it. So Hamilton got his wish. Now, this gave Congress the powers that were not explicitly spelled out in the Constitution, which is actually a violation of the 10th Amendment, which was in the Bill of Rights, but your teacher did not tell you to study, because it says, if it doesn't specifically say that the government has this power, then the power goes to the states or to the people, not to the government. If we don't specifically say this power is for the government, then it is not for the government, it's for the states or the people. So McCulloch versus Maryland fucked that up and hey, no. Federal bank was not explicitly given in the Constitution, and we let them have it anyway, and this opened a whole can of worms for everything else down the road, from the New Deal to Social Security to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to Obamacare. This was bad, because one of the Bill of Rights just completely got destroyed by one Supreme Court case. So then you had Gibbons versus Ogden. It's another court case in 1824. And this interpreted the commerce part. Commerce is doing business with people. In the Constitution, and they banned navigational monopolies, because basically New York was like, hey, we want one company to control all the ships in New York, and another ship company was like, no, we want to do business in New York too. And so Congress said, listen, nobody can tell anyone how to regulate business. Okay, so there are no monopolies. Nobody gets exclusive rights to anything. And this is what opened the West to expansion. So now people were moving west, and nobody could say, hey, this is our territory, and we're the only ones that can do business here. So that's what Gibbon versus Ogden did. Now remember, they still had Native Americans and Indians around, so the big one was the Cherokees. In 1819, they formed the Constitution, negotiated a treaty where they would be a sovereign nation. They refused to be a part of America despite many requests. So there's going to be more on that later. So the election of 1828 changed everything. So in 1824, John Quincy Adams won the election, but Jackson won the Electoral College. So now you're like, hey, I thought, when we have these elections, whoever wins the Electoral College wins. But you have to have a majority. And back then, it wasn't two parties. So you could split the Electoral College, but somebody not have a vast majority if there was only two. So right now the number is 270. Back then it probably was a lot less. It was a lot less. You just don't know what it was. So if no one has a supermajority, more than everybody else combined, the person who decides is the Speaker of the House, who at the time was a man named Henry Clay, who came in fourth place in the presidential election. So Clay's like, all right, I pick Adams. And shortly after that, John Quincy Adams made Clay his Secretary of State. So the people are like, wait, did you make a deal with him? And they call it corrupt bargaining. So everyone thought that John Quincy Adams was corrupt because he thought that he made a sketchy deal with Clay, that if Clay picked him, then he would allow him to be in his cabinet. And they also accused Quincy Adams of using taxpayer money and spending it on stuff that he wasn't supposed to. Misappropriating funds, it's called. So then, like people who support Adams were like, hey, if you're going to attack our guy, we're going to attack your guy. So they went after Andrew Johnson, who the election was against. And so they called him everything. They accused him and his wife of cheating and an adulterer. They called him a degenerate. They called him a gambler. And this led to the two political party system that we're used to now. And now you had conventions, and you had people, and you had politicians going right to the people to try to get their vote rather than representatives. And before, you just try to get to the influential people in society. Now they're going after everyone. They're having campaigns, and they're calling each other out and yelling at each other. And so the Jackson people started calling themselves Democratic Republicans, and then they're like, hey, you know what, that's too long, we're just going to say we're Democrats. And it's also because the Adams supporters started calling themselves National Republicans. You can't have Republicans in both names. It's kind of confusing. So that's how the 1828 election changed everything. So now that Jackson was president, he's like, you know what, we have all these Indians in the South, and we just want them out. And it's called the Trail of Tears. Now, Andrew Jackson is on the $20 bill. I don't know why, because he was kind of ruthless. So, now why did he want to do this? Was he just a racist? No, he wanted to strengthen the southern frontier, and he wanted Alabama and Mississippi to grow, and you can't grow when Indians are killing you all the time. So he just kicked them all out. The Cherokees are like, hey, no, remember in 1819, we declared ourselves a sovereign nation, so we had this treaty, and we're not going. You can't kick us out of our land. And Johnson sent the military after them and kicked them out. And this period is called the Trail of Tears. And the Cherokees were like, no, we're not leaving. And they went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, listen, Andrew Johnson, you can't kick the Cherokees out. All right? That's against our Constitution. We don't like it. And Jackson said, I don't give a shit. I'm doing it anyway. Which is not how the balance of powers is supposed to work. And then but Jackson did what he did, and he kicked him out. So then we're getting into the build-up to slavery. So then you had August 21st, 1831 in Virginia, when Nat Turner killed 200 people in a slave rebellion. Nat Turner was a slave, and Benjamin Turner was his owner, and Turner was not bad to his slave. He taught him how to read, write, taught him about religion, and introduced him to God, and that might have actually been a bad idea because now Nat Turner thought that God sent him to free or emancipate his fellow slaves. And then in 1831, there was an eclipse, kind of like what's going to happen in Avon Lake next year. Hopefully nobody does what Nat Turner did and take this as a sign from God that they need to start a rebellion. So he did. And he killed 6 members of the Travis family. He could secure their arms, and then 75 more slaves joined in, and they killed 55 white people. So After this, he hid around for 6 weeks until somebody found him, and he was hung in Jerusalem, Virginia, along with 16 others. So after this, the South is like, I don't think we should free these slaves. I mean, they're kind of violent and they're mean, and they might get revenge on us. Because before then, they're like, we had the Pennsylvania thing, Abolition Act, a few years ago, and then we have this cotton gin now. Maybe we should get rid of slaves. But after the Nat Turner Rebellion, they're like, I think we should just still keep them down because I don't really trust them. And so they made harsher laws, and they enslaved the people, which caused more of a problem between slaves and their owners. Because now the owners are like, listen, this guy was really nice, and he still attacked him and tried to kill his family. And, he taught them how to read and write, and he was good to them. So they were kind of wary to be nice to their slaves anymore after this. Like I said before, the Kansas-Nebraska Act fucked up the Missouri Compromise. So what happened was Kansas and Nebraska wanted to become states, and rather than say, all right, you're a slave and you're free, they're like, you know what, just decide for yourselves. Take a vote, and whatever you vote, you'll be a slave state or a free state. So this brought all these abolitionists, people who were against slaves, and all these pro-slavery people into Kansas and Nebraska to try to campaign and give their side of the story and why they should be the one that they pick. And that's why you get the term Bleeding Kansas. It's also the collapse of the Whig Party, and the Republican Party emerged as a party that opposes slavery in the territories. So then in 1836 it happened. Remember, everyone were having all these new territories, and Texas decided, you know what, I don't want to be part of Mexico anymore. And they basically copied the Declaration of Independence and used the same logic for why they need to leave, because Mexicans are infringing on their rights and they're not allowed to govern themselves. But they had more of a focus on private property, which Jefferson didn't really mention too much. So there were a series of government edicts and dissolution of state legislatures, disarmament of state militias, and they abolished the Constitution in 1824. So this was between the Texans and the Tejones. The Tejones were a mixture of Mexican Indian descent. So they captured San Antonio, and the government failed to protect their rights. At the Alamo, there's still a sign of when Texas asked America for help, and they said no. So that's why Texas believes they're individuals. But they had to leave, and because the Mexicans changed the government without their consent. And the big thing about the Revolutionary War was consent of the governed. If we are going to be ruled by you, you have to do it with our consent. Well, I have all these new states, and people want to move west. So there was 3 ways they did it. So in 1846, there was a Mormon trail. And the Mormon trail was just a religious thing. I don't know if you know that Mormon's a religion. It would help if you did. So Brigham Young is the leader of it. And they were being kicked out of the city in Nauvoo. So they had to find a new home for their church. And so they crossed Iowa, went to the Great Basin. They went into Utah and we'll set up a church here. And while on their way, some of them got lazy and didn't want to go anymore. So they just stopped, made a settlement, and planted their crops. The real adventurers were the people on the Oregon Trail. It's also called the Oregon-California Trail. It was the longest one of the 3 trails, and it was 2,000 miles from Independence, Missouri to Oregon City, which is current-day Portland, where my brother lives. A lot of people die on this trail because it went through harsh terrain, because it's in the north, but it was meant to reach the northwest, and they wanted to go for the gold trade, because they believed that God preordained that America would expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and the West was the future while the East was the past. This is what's called manifest destiny. So the manifest destiny has to do with the Oregon-California Trail, and also the gold rush. So they were leaving because they didn't have a lot of money. It's called economic hardship. So they couldn't find money, couldn't find jobs, and then the 1830, there was a real currency crisis like that we're having now. So they decided to go west, and so they were settlers. They were going to set up to live there. They wanted to settle and create a new life in the West. Now, the Santa Fe Trail was different because this wasn't to find a new place to live. This was just, we wanted to trade with Mexico. So there was an international trade route where we could go to Mexico and trade with them and exchange things. Now, this came in handy during the Mexican-American War because now we use it to invade New Mexico and fight them. But it was actually a trade route. So if it has to do with trading, it's the Santa Fe Trail. So it goes from the Missouri River to Santa Fe, and even though it's called Santa Fe, which is the capital of New Mexico, 2/3 of this trail is actually in Kansas. The rest is in Missouri, Oklahoma, Colorado, New Mexico. So remember, Santa Fe wants to trade, and the Oregon one wants to be settlers, and the Mormon Trail, we just did it for religious purposes. They want to do church. So now the Civil War is picking up, and the Compromise of 1850 happened because now we have all these new territories, so we have to keep talking about what's going to be a free state and what's going to be a slave state. Texas, they decided it's going to be a slave state. And so then Henry Clay from Kentucky, remember him from the 1828 debates, and Stephen Douglas, who lost to Lincoln in the election right before the Civil War, had made Texas give up New Mexico and make California a free state. In exchange, the South doesn't have to adopt the Wilson Proviso. So that was like the concession. Like, listen, we haven't. New Mexico is a free state. California is a free state. So you don't have to listen to this thing that you don't like. And Utah and New Mexico, they can decide for themselves. We're going to take a vote and see what they want. Now this is weird because New Mexico, you can't really plant anything because the terrain's not very good. So fighting for slavery in New Mexico is really kind of pointless, as you can't do anything, but you're just doing it out of principle that the South and the North should have an equal. The slave states or free states should be equal. So parts of New Mexico are above the Missouri Compromise now. So like that thing isn't really working anymore. To make everyone happy, the Fugitive Slave Act, which means if a slave escapes into a free state, you have to return them to their slave state. The North didn't like that because like, hey, we don't like slavery. We should use it as a safe haven for them. So that started being enforced more. So now the North is getting pissed. And they banned the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Now, there's a President Tyler who was against having slavery in the Southwest. This might not have passed, but he died, and the new president was okay with it. Now, the big person who was against it was the Senator John Calhoun of South Carolina, and if you remember, that's the first state that succeeded. So then you have 1857. You have the Supreme Court ruled in the Dred Scott decision. So Dred Scott was a slave, and his owner was like, you know what, we're going to move to Missouri. Or not Missouri, they moved to a free state. And Dred Scott's like, hey, if we live in a free state now, then I'm a free man, like, because there's no slavery here. And so they went to the Supreme Court about this. He's like, no, you're still my property. Goes, no, I'm not. I'm in a free state. So it's went on for 10 years, this Supreme Court case. Because, Scott's like, hey, I'm free because we're in this state. So the abolitionists were, so the Supreme Court said, no, he still owns you. You're still his property. It doesn't matter that you moved to a free state. If you start out as a slave, it doesn't matter if you move, you remain a slave. So the abolitionists, people who were against slavery, they were upset with this decision. And the pro-slave people were like, yeah, we finally got one that went our way. And then the Supreme Court just went nuts after this decision. Like, you know what? That Missouri Compromise has been working for like 30 years. No, it's unconstitutional. Like, you can't enforce it. It's against our rules. And Congress cannot tell you what can be a slave state and what can't be a slave state, a free state. Okay, they can't prohibit slavery in the U.S. territories that are in states. So if they're not a state, you can't decide what's going to happen to them. And they go, you know what? And slaves can never be citizens. Okay, they are not part of the United States. I don't know, but you know about the Three-Fifths Compromise. The Three-Fifths Compromise, and slaves were considered, when they counted the population, 3/5 of a person. And what people don't realize is that the South wanted them to be full people so they have more representatives in government. And the North is the one wanting them not to count at all. It's all about, how the government's set up and how many representatives you get based on population. Remember that Virginia plan we were talking about before. So that's a 3/5 compromise if it comes up. So John Sanford was the owner that got sued for it. So, but the weird thing about this whole story is that John Sanford got divorced, and it was his wife's slave. His wife remarried, and her new husband's like, you know what? Why are we keeping this guy? He's causing a lot of trouble. Just free him. So even though they won the court case, they never free him anyway. And so it's amazing that it actually had this much impact, considering they won, and they still gave him what he wanted anyway. Then the Civil War happens. Now, we went over this a lot on Monday. You know, starts in at Bunker Hill. It starts at Fort Sumter. Remember, Fortnite starts at Fort Sumter. It ends in a courthouse, Appomattox Courthouse. There's a lot of battles. The Union's fighting for to end slavery. The South wants to keep succeeding with the Union. They don't want to be part of us. And the Union is headed up by Ulysses S. Grant, and the Confederates headed up by Robert E. Lee. So this battle killed more Americans than the other battle, which kind of makes sense because it's America versus America. So the Battle of Gettysburg was the worst one. That's the bloodiest battle, and so Lincoln's like, hey, I need to rally the troops who won this really bloody battle. We lost a lot of men, so we're just going to try to rival them up. And the speech is very short. It's 271 words. But it's one of the most important speeches that ever happened. It's called the Gettysburg Address. And it starts with 407 years ago, which is just a weird way to say 83 years. So 83 years ago, they talk about the Declaration of Independence. And in the Declaration of Independence, they said all men are created equal, okay? So where do we have slavery with that? This doesn't make any sense. And so he did this at a dedication of soldiers of the National Cemetery. So he restated, all men are created equal. That's the Gettysburg Address. Like, hey, by the way, remember when we said in 1776 all men are created equal? Well, that includes black people too. The government by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth, because we're a nation conceived in liberty. So that's how it ends. That as a nation conceived in liberty, government by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. This was really weird, because the South is like, we're fighting for liberty. Like that, we wanted to be free to leave you guys and govern ourselves. And you gave this address that kind of makes our argument. So I don't really know what the hell you're talking about. All right. So in this war, the Union had the advantage because they had more people, and they had more money and better supplies and more weapons. But the South, their advantages is that they were better fighters. Like the Virginians that fought the Revolutionary War, so they were better at fighting, but there was less of them. And they were more motivated because they thought they were fighting for independence and their homeland, and the Union's fighting just to so that we can all remain as a group. We don't like that you left. And there were the border states of Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri that didn't go. Now, you got this question wrong in the test about what Illinois was. Illinois is not a border state. It's not a Confederate state. Abraham Lincoln is from Illinois. Abraham Lincoln is the head of the president of the Union. Jefferson Davis, who's from Virginia, is the head of the president of the Confederates. So Illinois is going to side with the person that's from their state. So Illinois is a Union state. Okay, so that's the Union advantage. So the Union strategy was to blockade the rivers and stop the South from you. Blockade means you just stop them. Basically, you put a lot of ships so that they can't use the riverways and the Mississippi River, and they can move their supplies using water. The South had ironclads, and when I was in Vicksburg, that ironclad picture I showed you, the reason why it's on land is because the Union diverted the river, and so all the water that was, went somewhere else, and it dried up, and then the ironclad was no longer in the water. So that's what they did. They didn't really attack the ship. They just moved the water so that the ship was useless. Yeah. So the Vicksburg is when they bombed and starved them. It was really kind of brutal what they did. And now, why do they want Vicksburg so bad? Now, if you saw my pictures from there, they have little placards on where the conservative platoons were and where the Union ones, and they were really, really close to each other. I don't even know how they didn't kill each other quicker. Now, why do they want Vicksburg so bad? Vicksburg's right on the Mississippi River, and the Mississippi River would split the South in two. It's a little common expression of united we stand, divided we fall. So if you are separated from half your army, then you're not doing too well. You're probably not going to do so well in the war, and they didn't. So although Vicksburg was brutal, it's not actually a total war. The total war comes from William Tecumseh Sherman. Remember, that was a badass. He was a savage guy, and his march to sea. So where is he marching to sea? He's marching across Georgia. They also said the Nazis in World War II and World War I is also a total war in which you just take out everyone. You don't just kill military people, you kill citizens too. You starve them and you destroy their economy. You basically, after we're done with you, no one's going to want to live here anyway. So you're not really that's like the most ruthless, savage way to have a war. And you know, if you wanted them to be part of your country, why would you destroy them all? But when it comes to Sherman, was like, fuck them, I'm gonna kill them. So that's what total war is. And an example is Sherman's march to sea across Georgia. So then you have Lincoln to give the Emancipation Proclamation. I've said several times what emancipation means. It means free the slaves. So Lincoln, Emancipation Proclamation, said slaves are free. No more slaves. And then into the Civil War, Appomattox Courthouse. And when they did that, when Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general, surrendered to the Union leader, Ulysses S. Grant, Grant had his men salute the Confederate soldiers. So you guys fought very hard, very valiantly, and we have a lot of respect for you, even though you guys lost. And the reason why he did that is it was Lincoln's goal to welcome the South back into the country as equals. And this whole thing is that we can all be Americans again, so don't be like, hey, we beat you, we're going to oppress you, fuck you. No. I'm like, listen, now with us. Now, the reason why Lincoln did this is because this was what everyone was doing at the time. You had Austria-Hungary combined into one country, Japan, which was all sexual, all uniting. So all these places in Europe and around the world are uniting, and he's in charge of the only country that's separating. So that's why he wanted everyone to come together. So that's a real reason for the war, but, you know, the whole freeing the slaves thing was a, minor detail and a secondary feature, but we're glad he did because slavery sucks. Now, even though Lincoln wanted this, everyone to play nice, not everyone was willing to do this, especially when John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln at Ford Theater. So they're like, all right, now that guy's out of the way, we'll do what we really want to do to these Confederates that are back into our country. So then you have the Reconstruction Acts of 1867. Remember, the post-war time is called Reconstruction. We destroyed the country by having this huge bloody battle with each other, and now we got to rebuild it, Reconstruction. So we have 1867 Reconstruction Act. They welcome the South back, but they separate them into 5 military zones. And all of them are headed by a Union soldier. Remember what Jefferson was bitching about to King George III? Like, hey, you have all these British people that are just planted in our cities and governing us and just walking around making sure that we all do what you want. We don't like that. Well, the North did the Union did the exact same thing to the Confederates when they rejoined our country. So they weren't being very Union and very American about that because they're going against the Declaration of Independence. So they said, hey, we will let you back, but you have to draft a new constitution that has universal suffrage. Suffrage is freedom to vote. So everyone gets to vote, and that includes black people. And you have to ratify the 13th and 14th Amendment. Now, when they talked about making new amendments to the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, they said you cannot force somebody to ratify or vote for an amendment. That's unconstitutional. During the Reconstruction Acts of 1857, they said, we don't give a shit. You cannot be a part of this country if you do not say you're going to abide by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Remember, you need 2/3 of the states to say yes. And they did. They gave in to the pressure. And But the Reconstruction Acts were very mean and wrong and anti-constitutional, anti-American, anti-everything, which is why President Johnson vetoed it. He's like, listen, you guys, this isn't nice. Veto. And Congress like, hey, if we get 2/3 of us to say that we really want this, your veto doesn't matter. So they overrode the veto and it became a law. But that's how the balance of powers works. The executive branch can veto the legislative branch, but if enough people in the legislative branch wants it, the president's veto doesn't matter. So, Reconstruction gave us the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So what are these amendments that they just had to ratify in order to become part of the country? Well, they're actually pretty good. First one, there's no slavery or indentured servants unless they are found guilty of a crime. That's what we fought the war over. Not really, but that's what happened, and that's what the Emancipation Proclamation came. So we're like, hey, Lincoln was right. No more slavery. We're done with slavery. Then they have the 14th Amendment. If you are born or naturalized in the United States, you are a citizen and an American. Illegal immigrants love this one. Like, hey, we're just going to sneak into your country, have a baby, and that baby is an American. Greeks did this too. My aunt did too. Well, my aunt was already an American, but she moved to Greece. But when she had her kids, she made sure she flew home to give birth so that her kids would be Americans. And that's the 14th Amendment. But there's many sections of the 14th Amendment. There's Section 2, where each state gets a representative based on how many people live there. So that's the Virginia plan again. If you're over 21, you can vote if you're a male. This whole 3/5 compromise thing, that's over. Slaves are full people now. They're not just 3/5 of a person. So that's in the 14th Amendment, that the 3/5 compromise is over, and if you don't listen to us, Congress can take away your representatives. So like, hey, you have 20 people representing you in D.C., but you're not going to let someone who's over 21 vote. Well, now you only have 18 representatives. This has never been enforced in the history of the United States. Now, last couple of years, there's a couple of things that have never been enforced in the United States that have been, but right now, it's never been enforced. And I also said, and this one's kind of mean, probably why the Confederates didn't like this one, they didn't want to ratify it, but they were forced into it. The next thing about the 14th Amendment, if you were a leader in the Confederacy and you were in their government, you cannot be in our government. You cannot hold office in the Union if you used to be a Confederate politician. And Section 4, the slave owners, you're not going to be compensated for the slaves we took. Yeah, you consider them your property. We don't think they were your property. We're not giving you any money for them. It's kind of a violation of the Constitution, where they said that if they take your property, then they have to compensate you in the Bill of Rights. So then we have the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment, I think, is kind of pointless because the 14th Amendment just said if you're over 21, you can vote. But the 15th Amendment's like, hey, you can vote, and you cannot be denied based on color, race, or previous conditions of servitude, aka if you used to be a slave. Basically, yeah, slaves can vote too. It's kind of pointless. The 14th Amendment said, if you're over 21, you can vote. 15th Amendment, like, we want to make sure that we are including slaves in this. And this might actually be necessary because, you know, when the Declaration of Independence, when we said all men are created equal, somehow slaves weren't included. So maybe we should just specify. So now, times are changing, technology is getting better, and the agricultural economy is failing. So it looks like Jefferson is kind of wrong, but this what happened, 90 years later, so he was right at the time, maybe. So now the Reconstruction economy is turning toward mills. Everyone's building mills. And they're actually, because the South had all the natural resources, but the factories were in the North during the Civil War. Now that kind of changed. So now the Southern Piedmont was a stretch between Virginia and Alabama, and that's where all the textile mills were. So they grew in the urban settings like Atlanta and Columbus, and the rural uplands in areas like Dalton. So in the 1880s, most were in the North, but now they're moving south by the 1920s. because the agriculture markets are unreliable. You have famines, you have the bad weather, so they had to pivot. And what made this a lot easier is when they built the railroads, because now the railroads made it easier to get coal, and coal was used to power steam engines and their machines, which was a lot better and more efficient than water. So now they actually had the technology and they had the means to get the raw materials like coal so that they could run their mills more efficiently. And so they're like, you know what? We're not going to sell grain and tobacco and cotton anymore. We're going to start making textiles and work in the factories. And now, why did it start in the South and not the North? Well, the South was a lot poorer than the North, like we said earlier. And with all these plantations being obsolete, we had this thing called carpetbaggers. Carpetbaggers were the North that came down to like buy up all the land that were no longer in use because the Southerners were either dead or embarrassed because they lost the war. And then you had the scalawags, which are the Southerners that let them who didn't really care that the Union was coming in. At the time of the Civil War, no Republican owned a slave. They were all Democrats. So Democrats were the slave owners. And the Democrats lived in the South. It's not like now. So this whole North coming down to buy up land and go for business, kind of changed this because Republicans were moving south and the Northern and Southerners were moving north, and so they kind of like switched places a little bit. And these Southerners were very unskilled workers, so they were cheap. That's basically they'll work for next to nothing. You have to pay a union more experienced person more money. So that's why these mills started up in the South, because they had cheap labor. So working in the factory sucks. You think that picking cotton was bad and working on the land and working on a field tilling soil, but it's nice to work outside and work in nature. When you're inside, you do the same thing over and over again. There's nothing to no animals to look at. Like in nature, something's always changing. But in the factory, it's the same shit all day for 10 to 12 hours, 6 days a week. And you're making shit money, so you don't work to support your family. Your entire family works in the factory because it's all hands on deck to try to get you something to eat. And there were no child labor laws back then, so little kids worked, 10 to 14-year-olds. So you and Athanilla would probably be working with your parents in the factory, and they liked people like Athanilla because they were little and they had small hands and they could reach into these huge hot furnaces and grab things that they couldn't get to because an adult's hand is big. So this is why we start having child labor laws, so that we can stop exploiting these children, and they work for cheap. People got sick and there were no unions back then. When you got sick and you couldn't work, you didn't get paid. And so they were hot, they were noisy, and they were very dangerous. And you're breathing. Some people would breathe in lint, and they would get lint in their lungs, so they couldn't breathe anymore. And then you're fucked. Because you can't really afford a doctor. You're basically doing this just to make ends meet and feed yourself. And now you're sick and you can't work, and you're gonna die. So this was a big adjustment for American society, and we were in the mills, but our manufacturing was good. And then in World War II, we were building Navy ships in an hour. So we're very good at building shit when we want to. But it came at a cost, because now, people had to work really hard, and it was tough. It was tough working in the factories. So that's your study guide. I hope it helped.